Today, I'm really excited because we are going to be covering an absolutely crucial subject to finishing tunes, and that is taking your tunes to phase three. Phase three of my, roughly 5-stage production process. There's phase three, there's 3 phases of songwriting and composition, and then there's 2 extra phases potentially, depending on how you're counting them. So the 3 phases are: number 1, the creation of the super loop. And that's where you get a ton of different ideas. You just say yes to everything, and you get a big stack where you just have way too many parts to play at once. And then phase 2 is the arrangement, where you take the super loop, duplicate it, duplicate it, duplicate it, fill up the arrangement, and subtract from the super loop to take the listener through a journey through your song to create a narrative. And then phase 3 is where you take your simple arrangement, usually involving lots of MIDI parts and lots of plugins and everything, and you want to get it into a more manageable format to finish up. And that involves rendering down all of your channels into stems, which are audio files instead of MIDI files. And then you have a much easier time finishing things when you've got this project where it's just full of stems. It's almost like you're like remixing yourself. Like a lot of the time when you do a remix, you get a bunch of stems from the original track, you load them into your project, and you're like, okay, let's change stuff. Same thing, only you're remixing the earlier version of the track. You're not actually making a whole new track. I mean, you can if you want, but it's a really, really great way to kind of like get all of your processor resources back. Usually things are pretty lean when you break things down to audio, and you can do all kinds of editing. You can mud pie some of your stems, or even maybe mud pie the whole mix down and bring it in. So I want to discuss a little bit about phase 3 and some of the finer points of getting your tracks ready to go to phase 3. And then I'm going to show you some examples of my tracks, and just, we're going to talk about all the issues and just go deep on phase 3. Hopefully we can cover everything this week, but this is a very deep subject. So this is just going to be, the basics of phase 3. What I'm going to do here, I'm just going to load up this timer beat that I made in February, and Metasign expressed some interest in collabing with me on this one. So, let's see, I opened the chat up there. Metasign expressed some interest in finishing this one up with me. So I'm going to make some stems here for Metasign, and I'll just show you some of the different concerns that come up, okay, when you're making stems. So I'll get my camera out of the way here. There we go. Okay, so this is my timer template with just the results of a timer in it. So I'll expand all my tracks here. So you can see there's a bunch of groups with a bunch of MIDI channels. This one has the main drum kit. This one has some chunks of mud pies, and this kind of arpeggiated blip noise. That was from my track Crystal Math with Ben Samples. I have repurposed it and used it many times. It's in some of the sound packs in the Producer Dojo members vault. It's in some of the sound packs. It's a great little sample. I've heard a lot of people use it, including Metasign. Here's the Moog subs. Right, here's this respace that I like to use as a riser. Right. There's this bass from Serum. Here's another Serum bass. All right. And then here are the melody channels. And in the melody channel, most of my timer beats are based on this chop. And this chop is where I take a track or a mud pie or whatever, and I break it out onto the pads and then sequence the pads. The first thing I would do if I'm making stems is I'd delete anything that is unused, because that's just going to be taking up space and taking up processor resources. So I delete anything that's not used, like this. And then, yeah, there's some more unused channels. And then I didn't use any of these. Okay, cool. So that's made it lean and mean. And now, if you want, from here, you can stem the whole thing fairly easily by going to File, Export Audio Video, and then in this Export Audio Video menu, there are a bunch of different options. So one of the options here is pretty cool, is where you can go all individual tracks, okay? And this is going to render every single thing in the project. It'll render the drum group, it'll render each of the individual MIDI channels, etc. And the settings that you want to use are 32-bit without dithering. I mean, you can't dither a 32-bit file, so no dithering. Sample rate, you'd want to have it on 48. And then when you render all individual tracks, this is really cool. See this option? This is a new option, rendering option, include, return, and master effects. When you turn that on, that's going to render all of the tracks through the group of, through the master. So if you have anything on the master, in my case, I do, it will run through this drop rack, this low pass, this mastering chain, etc. The problem is that if you render everything like this, it's going to make a ton of files, okay? And that can be cumbersome. And then also you end up with this thing where, like, let's say you have a limiter on the master. Each one of those individual tracks is also going to run through the limiter. And when you try to sum them again, it's going to have applied all of those effects far too much. You know, like if everything's run through a limiter, it's all your leveling's gone, everything's over compressed. It's like a real problem. Okay, so usually I don't do that because it makes too many files, and B, you know, there's all kinds of processing like that is going to be printed into these stems that you don't necessarily want. So for example, you can see here, if I go here and go add lane for each automated envelope, you can see there's a lot of automation on my drum group. Okay, and a lot of that automation is going to, you know, really affect how everything in that group sounds. And I kind of want to, like, not like, because see on this drum bus, right, there's this scratch rack, the beat repeat, the tight delay, the gated verb, and some volume things here, transform type gate thing here, a low pass, a high pass, and a drum bus that's also acting as a limiter. If I run all these individual drum tracks through this drum group and then I try to sum them again later, it's not going to sound the same. That is going to be too much limiting. There's going to be too much of everything. Okay, so it's not really you know, it's not really a good idea to do that. So normally what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll select each one of the tracks and I'll freeze it and flatten it. So that way all of the plugins on the group stay the same, right? All of that processing is still fluid, it's still malleable, it has not been printed in. And all I'm doing is just printing each of these individual tracks. And I do that by right click to freeze and then right click to flatten. So rather than making you watch me do all that, I made another save where I've done that. So I'm going to not save that. Okay, so here you can see that I've frozen and flattened each of the individual tracks in here. That's going to sound exactly the same as it was before, but way less processor use. Okay, really, really nice. And then one of the really great things about this is once you do this, you can go in, you can zoom in, you can see, you know, any volume level inconsistencies that you might want to clear up, any pops and clicks are going to show up, any timing correction errors. A lot of the time you can see lots of stuff that you can't hear, so that's a big bonus. But the main question about in this process is, what do you do with your main drum kit, with your kicks and snares and stuff? So you know, this one I froze it because it's just this sound. Yeah, see there, you know, if I were to come in and finish this, you can see that there's this click that I didn't notice before, but I'm probably going to want to get rid of that little click, you know, in here. And these are little artifacts that you can't normally see until you've taken things to stems. You also might, sometimes there will be latency that is causing, like sometimes the plugin latency can cause your drums to shift off of the grid, and you'll have to go in and tidy them up too. So it's nice to be able to see what you're doing. You can fix any timing inconsistencies. You can fix any little pops and clicks and put fades on them and everything. But yeah, so yeah. All right. So then the question arises, what do you do with your main drum kit? So in my main drum kit here, there's a lot of different sounds. You wouldn't necessarily want to mix these together. You can expand the drum rack here and see all of the separate sounds in the drum rack and mix them as you would with the traditional kind of mixer. But sometimes that's kind of like, you know, you don't necessarily want to flatten your whole drum kit because, you know, maybe on your kick, you know, like your kick is triggering side chains and stuff, and you don't want to mess it up. You know, so a lot of the time, what I'll do is I'll create a duplicate of the main drum rack, right? And then I'll go in, and in this case, I'm going to solo just the riser and the spin back, right? And I'm going to call this riser plus spin back. And then I'm going to freeze and flatten that. And then that's going to give me just the riser and the spin back. Now I'm going to duplicate this again, and in this case I'm going to solo the clap and the vocal and then all that kind of stuff. I'll call this misc, and then freeze and flatten that. But I'm basically separating these by sound type. You know, the sounds that are kind of the most appropriate to group together are going to be grouped together. If your side chain is an audio side chain, then you can freeze and flatten your kick. But if you are using a plugin like Shaperbox or LFO tool to accomplish your side chaining, a lot of the time, like let's say we were using LFO tool to accomplish a side, right? Let's say I want this kick to trigger a side chain. So let's put a side chain on our bass group, and I'm going to take off the old side chain, and I'm going to add LFO tool. So LFO tool is a really, really great plugin from Extra Records, makers of Serum. And I want to put on a note gate on this side chain because I want a MIDI note to trigger the side chain. So now I'm going to go into my kick, and I want to send that MIDI note from this drum cell and this drum cell only to the side chain. So I'm going to go into my drum rack, and I'm going to select the individual sampler that the kick is on, and I'm going to group it. And then inside of that rack, I'm going to go put the external MIDI instrument plugin. And then this plugin is going to send MIDI to bass group, and you can see it's now sending MIDI to LFO tool. And now every time that kick kicks, you see it's triggering that side chain. Okay, so you know, a lot of the time, now I don't necessarily want to do that here, but you wouldn't want to turn that kick into MIDI. But let's say you wanted to flatten that, and you wanted to have your cake and eat it too. You duplicate it, right? And I'll call this one kicks, right? And then I'll freeze and flatten this one with all the kicks. And then inside the old drum rack, you could either mute everything, or better, deactivate everything except for the one that you want. So now I'm just gonna do that. And then if I went in here, I could either mute everything, and still the side chain is still gonna trigger because it's only muting the mixer. There's nothing stopping this there's nothing stopping this MIDI note from going to the side chain that I assigned it to, right? There's nothing stopping that. So muting either the channel here or on the mutes here, that's not going to stop the side chain from triggering. But a lot of the time I'll go in and I'll basically just find everything that I can and just deactivate it all. You know, just deactivate all those things. And then, you know, here I'd deactivate this, but I'd leave this MIDI channel going. Then here, just deactivate that, and then go and just deactivate all of the devices. And then that'll make it so that you are, like, let's say you did a bunch of complex EQing, or you loaded some kind of bulky plugins inside of your drum kit. deactivating them gets you your processor back, whereas simply muting them, they're still chugging away in the background using all of that processor. So then if I go like this, right, then this now is just full of deactivated plugins. The only one that is active is this one here that would be sending to the sidechain.